There are moments in a war when everything shifts. Not because someone gives a speech, not because a flag goes up, but because the enemy decides not to run. September 2006, Kandahar Province. Canadian troops moved into the farming districts of Panjwayi and Zhari, expecting resistance. What they found instead were trench lines, machine guns, and fighters waiting in prepared positions. This was not a roadside bomb, not a sniper shot from a doorway. This was a deliberate stand. Operation Medusa would become Canada's largest combat operation since Korea, and it would force a country to confront what this war really was. In 2006, Canada's mission in Afghanistan shifted south. For several years, Canadian forces had operated mainly in Kabul. That mission focused on security and stabilization. It was dangerous, but it was not the center of the Taliban insurgency. Kandahar was different. Kandahar Province was the birthplace of the Taliban movement. It was where the group first rose to power in the 1990s. It also sat near key roads linking Afghanistan to Pakistan. Fighters, weapons, and money flowed through those routes. By early 2006, the Taliban had regrouped. Attacks increased across southern Afghanistan. Small ambushes became more common. Improvised explosive devices appeared more often along roads. District centers, once considered secure, began slipping under Taliban influence again. NATO's International Security Assistance Force expanded operations into the south that year. Canada took responsibility for Kandahar Province. This was no longer a peacekeeping role. It was a counterinsurgency in the Taliban's home territory. Brigadier General David Fraser commanded Canadian forces in the region. Under his authority, Canadian troops formed Task Force Afghanistan. At the core of the combat element was 1st Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, known as 1 PPCLI. They would not fight alone. Afghan National Army units were assigned to operate beside them. NATO allies, including the United States, provided artillery and air support. The ground they moved into was deceptive. South of Kandahar City lay Panjwayi and Zhari districts. The land was flat but crowded. Irrigation canals cut across farmland. Thick grape rows created narrow lanes. Mud-walled compounds stood behind tree lines. Visibility was often limited to short distances. It was farmland built for agriculture. It was also ideal defensive terrain. By mid-2006, intelligence indicated that Taliban fighters were concentrating in this area. Instead of staying scattered in small insurgent cells, they were gathering in larger formations. Reports suggested prepared fighting positions and defensive works. The Taliban appeared ready to contest control of Panjwayi and Zhari directly. Canadian and NATO planners developed a large operation to clear the area. The goal was straightforward: dislodge Taliban forces, restore government control, and secure the approaches to Kandahar City. The operation was named Medusa. The expectation was heavy resistance. No one assumed the Taliban would simply disappear, but past engagement suggested that once faced with sustained pressure, insurgent fighters would withdraw. Instead, something different was taking shape. On September 2, 2006, Operation Medusa began, and the farmland of Panjwayi would become a battlefield. Operation Medusa was not designed to be a siege. It was planned as a deliberate clearing operation. By late summer 2006, Taliban fighters had established strong influence in parts of Panjwayi and Zhari districts. These areas sat southwest of Kandahar City. If left unchecked, they threatened the security of the provincial capital itself. The goal of Operation Medusa was clear: push Taliban forces out of these districts, break their hold on the population, and restore Afghan government control. The operation began on September 2, 2006. Canadian forces would advance into Taliban-controlled areas, supported by Afghan National Army units. NATO allies, including the United States, would provide artillery and close air support. The idea was to apply enough pressure that Taliban fighters would either withdraw or be defeated in place. It followed a familiar counterinsurgency model: clear the area, then allow Afghan authorities to re-establish governance. The expectation was resistance. What planners did not fully expect was the scale. Intelligence before the operation suggested that Taliban fighters were present in significant numbers. Reports indicated defensive preparations, but estimates varied. As in many insurgencies, accurate numbers were difficult to confirm. Still, the assumption held that once controlled by a coordinated NATO assault, Taliban forces would not hold fixed ground for long. That assumption proved optimistic. As Canadian units prepared to move, they organized into coordinated battle groups. Infantry would lead the advance. Armored vehicles would provide mobility and firepower. Engineers would address mines and improvised explosive devices. Artillery assets stood ready to deliver indirect fire if needed. Afghan National Army soldiers were embedded in the operation from the start. Their presence was important. The objective was not simply to remove Taliban fighters, but to show that Afghan forces could hold and secure their own districts. From a planning perspective, Medusa was structured in phases. Initial movements would probe Taliban positions and establish footholds. Follow-on elements would expand the cleared areas. Once Taliban resistance collapsed or withdrew, stabilization efforts would begin. On paper, it was a logical approach, but the terrain complicated everything. Panjwayi and Zhari are not open desert battlefields. The irrigation networks created natural obstacles. Grape rows formed tight corridors that restricted movement and visibility. Mud compounds provided cover against small arms fire and fragments. Narrow paths limited the movement of vehicles. In this kind of terrain, defenders held the advantage. As the operation began, Canadian troops advanced into these districts and began encountering resistance almost immediately. What started as sporadic contact quickly grew more organized. It became increasingly clear that Taliban forces were not planning to disengage quickly. Instead of fading away, they were attempting to hold ground. This changed the nature of the operation. A planned clearing mission was starting to look like something larger. Operation Medusa had begun with a clear objective and a defined plan. But within days, Canadian commanders would realize they were facing not just an insurgent presence, but a prepared defense. The first movements into Panjwayi began almost immediately after September 2, 2006. Canadian soldiers advanced into farmland that looked quiet from a distance. Low mud walls, grape rows, tree lines, irrigation ditches cut through the fields like shallow scars. It did not look like a battlefield. Then the shooting started. Initial contact came fast and from multiple directions. Small arms fire cracked across the fields. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked towards advancing vehicles. Machine guns opened up from concealed positions. This was not scattered resistance. It was coordinated. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves to cover likely approach routes. Irrigation ditches allowed them to move unseen between positions. Mud compounds provided solid cover. From outside, the structures looked like farm buildings. From inside, they were firing points. Canadian infantry pushed forward carefully, clearing compounds one by one. Visibility was often limited to a few dozen meters. Grape rows formed tight corridors. You could not see far ahead. Every corner was a question mark. Almost immediately, commanders realized the resistance was heavier than expected. Instead of breaking contact and slipping away, Taliban fighters stayed engaged. They held positions, they fired in organized bursts, they shifted between prepared locations. The fight intensified quickly. Artillery support was called in to suppress enemy positions. Indirect fire struck known or suspected firing points. Close air support was requested as Taliban fighters concentrated in certain areas. The soundscape changed. Rifles and machine guns were now joined by the distant thud of artillery. Aircraft circled overhead. Explosions shook orchard walls. Dust filled the air. But even with fire support, movement remained slow. The terrain favored defenders. Irrigation canals broke up formations. Narrow paths forced troops into predictable lanes. Engineers worked to detect and neutralize improvised explosive devices. The threat of IEDs slowed advances and increased tension. Every step forward required caution. Afghan National Army soldiers fought alongside Canadian forces during these early engagements. They advanced through the same terrain, shared the same risks, and came under the same fire. The objective remained clear: push Taliban forces out and secure the districts. But the tempo of the fight was changing. Reports from the ground indicated that Taliban numbers were higher than originally estimated. Instead of a few scattered cells, there appeared to be organized defensive elements spread across key terrain. Some positions resembled trench lines. Others were reinforced compounds linked by covered routes. Machine gun fire overlapped from multiple angles, suggesting planning and coordination. This was not an accidental stand. It looked deliberate. As the days progressed, Canadian forces encountered sustained firefights rather than brief skirmishes. Engagements lasted hours. Air support became more frequent. Artillery missions increased. The assumption that pressure alone would cause Taliban forces to withdraw began to fade. Instead, the battle was expanding. Casualties began to mount. Medical evacuation helicopters landed in contested areas to extract the wounded. Troops continued pushing forward, clearing one position after another. The fighting in Panjwayi and Zhari was no longer a sweep. It was a set-piece battle forming in real time. And for many Canadian soldiers on the ground, it became clear that Operation Medusa was not going to be over quickly. The Taliban had chosen to stand, and the farmland west of Kandahar was turning into a battlefield that neither side could ignore. By the second week of September, Operation Medusa had changed in scale. What began as a clearing operation was now a sustained battle. Canadian commanders understood that the Taliban presence in Panjwayi and Zhari was larger and more organized than first believed. Estimates suggested several hundred fighters were operating in the area. They were not scattered, they were concentrated. The district around villages in the Pashmul area became a focal point. Canadian forces adapted. Infantry units moved carefully through orchard lanes, clearing compounds step by step. Armored vehicles, including LAV-3 platforms, provided mobility and direct fire support. Engineers worked ahead of advancing elements, searching for mines and improvised explosive devices. Progress was measured in meters. Artillery played an increasing role. Indirect fire missions struck identified Taliban positions, especially trench lines and reinforced compounds. The use of artillery was significant, reflecting the intensity of the fighting. Close air support was also heavily employed. NATO aircraft conducted strikes against entrenched positions after ground forces identified targets. These strikes were used to break defensive lines that proved difficult to assault directly. The scale of firepower underscored the seriousness of the engagement. Taliban fighters continued to hold their ground in many sectors. They fired from prepared positions and shifted between compounds. Some trench systems allowed them to engage and then reposition without exposing themselves in open terrain. In several areas, overlapping fields of fire created dangerous corridors for advancing troops. Machine guns covered irrigation ditches. RPG teams targeted vehicles moving along narrow routes. This was no longer an insurgent harassment campaign. It resembled a conventional defense. The fighting around Pashmul became particularly intense. Taliban forces used the village and surrounding farmland as a defensive hub. Canadian units pushed into the area under sustained fire. Clearing operations required coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. Each compound had to be secured individually. Each trench line had to be neutralized. Each stretch of grape field had to be crossed under observation. Casualties increased on both sides. Medical evacuation helicopters flew into contested zones to extract the wounded. Dust clouds marked landing zones carved out under pressure. The Afghan National Army continued to operate alongside Canadian forces during these engagements. Their participation was central to the long-term objective of restoring Afghan government authority in the district. At the same time, the intensity of NATO firepower drew attention beyond the battlefield. Reports emerged of civilian casualties during air and artillery strikes. The fighting occurred in populated farming districts, and the presence of non-combatants complicated operations. These reports added political pressure to an already demanding military situation. Canadian commanders faced difficult choices. Reducing fire support could increase risk to ground troops. Increasing it could raise the likelihood of civilian harm and political backlash. The operation pressed forward. By mid-September, the weight of coordinated firepower began to affect Taliban defensive cohesion. Some positions were destroyed outright, others were abandoned after sustained bombardment. Intercepted communications suggested strain within Taliban ranks. But even as positions fell, resistance did not collapse all at once. Taliban fighters launched counterattacks in certain sectors. Small groups attempted to reoccupy abandoned positions or strike advancing units from unexpected angles. The battlefield remained fluid. What was clear, however, was that Operation Medusa had become one of the most intense battles of the Afghan War in 2006. The farmland of Panjwayi and Zhari was no longer just contested ground, it was a front line, and the turning point of the battle was approaching. By the middle of September 2006, Operation Medusa had reached its most critical phase. For days, Canadian and Afghan forces had pushed through trench lines, orchards, and compounds under sustained fire. Artillery and close air support had been used repeatedly to break up defensive positions. Taliban fighters had resisted in organized pockets, especially around strongholds in the Panjwayi area. But pressure was building. The longer the battle continued, the more strain it placed on Taliban defenses. Defensive lines that had once appeared solid began to fragment. Positions destroyed by artillery could not always be reoccupied. Supply and communication between Taliban elements became more difficult under constant surveillance and air support. Canadian commanders adjusted their approach. Instead of attempting rapid movement across heavily defended terrain, units began methodically dismantling Taliban positions. Infantry advanced with armor support. Engineers cleared routes deliberately. Fire support was tightly coordinated before ground forces moved into exposed areas. It was slow, it was deliberate, and it began to work. One of the defining features of this phase was the combined use of artillery and air-delivered munitions against entrenched positions. When trench systems or fortified compounds proved too costly to assault directly, firepower was used to weaken or destroy them before troops moved in. This reduced some immediate risk to advancing soldiers, but it also highlighted the scale of the battle. The level of coordinated firepower being used was far beyond what most people associated with counterinsurgency operations. Taliban fighters attempted to adapt. In some sectors, they withdrew from fixed positions before they were overrun. In others, small groups attempted counterattacks, probing for weak points. Fighters moved through irrigation networks and attempted to re-engage from new angles. But the larger defensive effort was losing cohesion. Momentum began shifting. By around September 9th to the 12th, key Taliban defensive hubs had been disrupted. Fire support had degraded trench systems. Ground forces had seized critical areas, and resistance remained, but it was less organized. Taliban fighters increasingly disengaged rather than holding the last position. This marked the turning point of Operation Medusa. The objective had been to dislodge Taliban forces from Panjwayi and Zhari districts. By mid-September, that displacement was underway. Fighters were moving west and south, withdrawing from concentrated defensive lines. For Canadian forces, the shift was noticeable. Instead of encountering entrenched machine guns at every approach, patrols began finding abandoned positions. Instead of sustained hours-long firefights, there were shorter engagements with smaller groups. The battle was not over. Isolated resistance continued. IED threats remained constant. Clearing operations still carried risk. But the coordinated defense stand that had defined the early days of Medusa was breaking apart. The cost, however, had been real. 12 Canadian soldiers would lose their lives during Operation Medusa. Afghan National Army casualties were also significant. NATO estimated that hundreds of Taliban fighters were killed during the operation, though exact numbers remain debated. Beyond the battlefield, political scrutiny intensified. Reports of civilian casualties during air and artillery strikes drew attention and criticism. Questions were raised about the balance between force protection and collateral damage. On the ground, however, the immediate concern was securing what had been cleared. Operation Medusa had shifted from breaking a defensive line to consolidating gains. But the question remained, would the cleared ground hold? And that question would shape what came next. By the time the heaviest fighting subsided in mid-September 2006, Operation Medusa had reshaped more than just the map. It had reshaped perception. For Canada, the cost was measured first in lives. 12 Canadian soldiers were killed during Operation Medusa. Dozens more were wounded. For a country that had not fought a battle of this scale since the Korean War, the losses struck hard. The names of the fallen were read in Parliament. Flags were lowered. The repatriation ceremonies at CFB Trenton became national moments. Each casualty forced Canadians to confront a reality that had been easy to overlook in earlier years of the mission. This was not peacekeeping. This was war. Afghan National Army units also suffered casualties during the fighting. Precise figures are hard to confirm, but Afghan soldiers were engaged alongside Canadian forces in the same orchards and compounds. Their losses were part of the cost of the operation, even if they received less international attention. On the Taliban side, NATO estimated that hundreds of fighters were killed during the course of the battle. The exact numbers remain debated. Battlefield claims and later assessments did not always align. What is clear is that the Taliban absorbed heavy losses in men and material. Operation Medusa took place in populated farming districts. Artillery and airstrikes used to break entrenched positions sometimes struck areas where civilians lived. Reports of civilian casualties emerged during and after the operation. The full number remains contested, but the issue became politically sensitive. For Canadian commanders, the challenge was stark. The terrain favored defenders. Entrenched positions were costly to assault directly. Fire support reduced risk to ground troops, but carried its own consequences. Every decision carried weight. Back home in Canada, public debate intensified. Support for the mission in Afghanistan had already been divided. Operation Medusa sharpened that divide. Some saw the battle as proof that Canada was confronting a serious insurgent threat and doing so decisively. Others questioned whether the mission's objectives justified the growing toll. For soldiers on the ground, the debate was distant. What mattered was the next patrol, the next clearing operation, the next stretch of irrigation ditch that might conceal a threat. The psychological impact of Medusa was significant. Troops who fought there experienced sustained combat, unlike earlier phases of the mission. Hours-long firefights, coordinated enemy defenses, close-range engagements in confined terrain. It changed how many viewed the war. It also changed how the Taliban viewed NATO forces in Kandahar. The battle demonstrated that NATO, including Canada, was willing to commit large-scale firepower and accept casualties to dislodge entrenched fighters. Operation Medusa did not end the insurgency in Kandahar, but it did mark a shift. For Canada, the war was no longer defined by patrols and checkpoints. It had produced a battle. and the cost of that battle would shape everything that followed. By September 17, 2006, the main phase of Operation Medusa had ended. Taliban forces had been pushed out of many of their entrenched positions in Panjwayi and Zhari districts. Defensive trench systems were destroyed or abandoned. Weapons caches were seized. Key areas southwest of Kandahar city were back under Afghan government control. On paper, the operation had achieved its immediate objective. They had been dislodged. From a tactical standpoint, it was a success. Canadian forces, working alongside Afghan National Army units and supported by NATO artillery and air power, had broken a concentrated defensive effort. The scale of the operation demonstrated that NATO could mass force, coordinate firepower, and defeat entrenched fighters in open battle. But war is not decided on paper. The larger question was whether those gains would hold. Counterinsurgency doctrine often describes three phases: clear, hold, build. Operation Medusa clearly accomplished the first phase. Taliban fighters were forced out of key terrain. The second phase, holding that terrain, was more complicated. Panjwayi and Zhari were not empty landscapes. They were populated farming districts with complex social and tribal dynamics. Removing fighters from trenches did not automatically remove their influence from villages. Sustained security required continued presence. It required Afghan forces capable of maintaining order. It required reconstruction and governance. Those elements take time. In the months following Medusa, Canadian and Afghan forces remained active in the region. Additional operations were launched to reinforce gains. Some areas saw improved security for periods of time. But the Taliban did not disappear. As with many insurgencies, fighters adapted. Some withdrew temporarily. Others returned in smaller groups. Influence shifted rather than vanished. This does not erase the tactical result of Medusa. It clarifies it. Operation Medusa was not designed to end the war in southern Afghanistan. It was designed to break a specific concentration of Taliban forces threatening Kandahar. In that mission, it succeeded. It also revealed something important. The Taliban in 2006 were capable of organizing semi-conventional defenses. They could mass fighters, dig trenches, and attempt to hold ground. That lesson shaped how NATO approached later operations. Future planning increasingly assumed that insurgents might choose to stand and fight under certain conditions. Fire support coordination, armor integration, and route clearance procedures evolved accordingly. For Canada, Medusa marked a shift in identity. For decades, Canadian forces had been associated primarily with peacekeeping operations, blue helmets, buffer zones, ceasefire monitoring. In Panjwayi, Canadian forces fought a sustained, combined arms battle against an entrenched enemy. That reality changed public perception at home and operational expectations abroad. Was Operation Medusa a victory? Tactically, yes. Strategically, the answer depends on the time frame. In September 2006, the Taliban were driven from their strongholds in Panjwayi and Zhari. Kandahar city was less immediately threatened. In the longer arc of the Afghan War, control remained contested. Medusa did not end the insurgency, but it proved that when the Taliban chose to stand and fight, NATO and Canada would stand as well. Operation Medusa ended in September 2006. The orchards of Panjwayi and Zhari grew quiet again. Trenches were abandoned, compounds were repaired, farmers returned to fields that had been front lines only days before. But the operation did not fade away. For Canada, Medusa became a defining chapter of the Afghan War. It was the largest combat operation undertaken by Canadian forces since the Korean War. It forced a national conversation about the nature of the mission in Afghanistan. The image of Canada as primarily a peacekeeping nation gave way to more complicated reality. Canadian soldiers had fought a sustained battle using artillery, armor, and close air support, and they had taken losses doing it. Inside the military, the lessons were practical. Operation Medusa reinforced the importance of combined arms integration. Infantry, armor, engineers, artillery, and air support had to work together in close coordination. In terrain as restrictive as Panjwayi's grape fields and irrigation canals, small mistakes could have large consequences. Route clearance procedures evolved. Communication between ground units and air support became even more refined. Intelligence assessments placed greater emphasis on the possibility that insurgents might mass and defend terrain rather than disperse. The Taliban's decision to fight conventionally, even temporarily, influenced NATO's planning. Medusa also highlighted the political dimension of modern warfare. Reports of civilian casualties during the operation underscored the difficulty of fighting in populated areas. Tactical success could generate strategic pressure. Commanders had to balance force protection with broader mission goals. This tension would follow NATO forces throughout the Afghan War. For Afghan National Army units, participation in Operation Medusa was part of a longer process of development. Fighting alongside NATO forces in a large-scale battle was both a test and a training ground. Building a force capable of independently holding contested districts remained one of the war's central challenges. In the years that followed, Panjwayi and Zhari would continue to see violence. Control shifted, operations continued. No single battle determined the final outcome of the war. But Medusa stood out. For the soldiers who fought there, the legacy was personal. Operation Medusa was not an abstract campaign. It was a series of firefights in tight orchard lanes. It was artillery missions called in under pressure. It was evacuation helicopters landing in dust clouds while gunfire continued nearby. In the broader history of the Afghan War, Medusa occupies a specific place. It marked the moment when Canada's mission in Kandahar became undeniably combat-focused. It marked a period when the insurgency revealed its capacity for organized resistance. And it marked a turning point in how both sides understood the conflict. The trenches in Panjwayi were eventually filled, but the lessons remained. Wars rarely announce when they change. They shift in orchards, in irrigation ditches, in the decision on one side to dig instead of disappear. Operation Medusa was not the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, and it was not the end, but it was a moment when illusion fell away. In September 2006, Canadian soldiers fought a sustained battle against an entrenched in Panjwayi and Zhari. 12 of them did not come home. Hundreds more carried the memory of those fields with them. The Taliban were pushed back. The insurgency was not finished. Medusa did not decide the war. It revealed it. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?